I'm very pleased to welcome a long-standing friend of ISB, Dr. R. Balasubramaniam, or Balu, as he is known amongst us. Today, we're discussing his book, The Power Within, where he amalgamates Western and Indic perspectives on leadership to provide a roadmap for those who aspire to a life of public service. I think that's fairly accurate, no?
It is actually.
And it does so through the lived experiences of our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi ji. It's a fascinating read, Balu. Welcome to ISB.
Thank
it's
you.
always great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Let's kickstart by talking a little bit about what inspired you to do this. And I'm going to push you a little here, right? Because there is a large literature there on leadership. You are a scholar of this literature yourself. You know that there is a large literature there. You say in the book that scholarship in the West has largely focused on traits. But I would argue that while early research has, focused on traits, later research, even in the West, does note that, behaviors are more proximal to performance of groups, of organizations, of individuals, and therefore they are more salient than traits. The behaviors and actions are more salient than traits. And the literature asks questions about how can leaders motivate by empowering, by inspiring, how can they use rewards and incentives, how must they make decisions. So there's a vast literature there which goes beyond traits and looks at actions and behaviors of leaders that inspire, that make them inspiring. So what is the specific gap in the leadership space that you wanted to address and sought to address and study through this book?
It's a great question to begin, actually. Quite a challenging one, too. What I've tried to do is not say that something is not good enough or something is damn good.
Sure.
I've tried to use the Indic lens before I get into the core of your question, why did I even write a book? I write it in the preface, why and the leadership book?
Correct.
I think, as I know, annually 25,000 books, mostly in the US, gets published, from leadership for dummies to very high-end academic works. Why and the book is a question I asked myself. That journey actually goes back 30, 40 years of my life. And when I started my career life, whatever you call it, with indigenous tribal communities, living amongst them, amidst them, and started working with a lot of traditional tribal chieftains who inherit the legacy of leading their tribes or communities. And observing them and recognizing that they don't go to any Harvard Business School or ISBs, and they just learn what they learn by actually as a lived experience through life.
Right.
And there too, they were never the celebrated persona. It never struck me at that time. And then life went on. I really thought that knowledge has to come from outside. The university degrees give you knowledge. So the search for knowing more, understanding more, and the struggle to understand why policymakers mess up. And they bring in policies without really understanding communities. So I thought maybe first I thought policies are screwed up. Then I thought the policy maker is screwed up. Then I realized that the leadership leading and guiding the policy maker to appreciate all this is messed up. That started my journey into understanding leadership. That's how I started. That took me also to the Kennedy School, understanding policy, leadership, degrees and fellowships. Later, I realized that I learned a lot. I learned a particular way of looking at it. But I also learned leadership is always in context. And I was challenged by the fact that we imitate the cultural appropriateness. We don't really make it appropriate to the situation we live in, but we imitate it because we imitate the solution frameworks also.
Right.
And we try to pre-package it and sell it in the context of a different culture. So though we talk of cultural competencies, I really understood that most leadership models are not embedded in that. The primary cultural difference I noticed between the way the Western narratives are shaped, which many of us studied and went deep into. And then I started my work on understanding of Indian scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, even things like the Jataka tales, the Panchatantra. It was so neatly packaged. If you look at India, the diversity of information that is packaged, from a child who can understand from the Panchatantra or a Jataka tales. Today we watch Tom and Jerry cartoons, but Jataka tales is actually a cartoonified version of such enormous morals and leadership traits, etc. To Upanishads, to stuff like, the enormous literature we have through our own Purana, the Itihasa, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. I realized there's so much stuff in it which I didn't know enough about. And not having been a student of Sanskrit, I had to start learning a little bit of Sanskrit. I still know only, I can say I'm in the periphery, but I started reading up the commentaries, the different works, etc. The distinct feature I recognize is despite the fact the Western leadership literature is moving towards what you said, the behaviors and the actions, it still celebrates the individual. Whereas Indic thinking is to subsume the individual identity and egos into becoming one with the work that you're enabling, or to looking at society as an end result of what you're doing. If I'd explained a little more, I use this Vedic statement which Vivekananda uses it in several places. He says, Atmano mokshartam jagat hitayacha, where it's a unique combination of the world outside, the ecosystem outside of us, which is what Western leadership celebrates. How do I perform in an ecosystem which is completely outside of me? So the power without is celebrated there. Whereas in India, we talk about not the power without. Power without is the manifestations of the actions emanating from the power within. And that's a huge difference. And the power within, and how do you control it? So when I looked at public leadership, and beginning from Mahabharata, the Rajadharma description, where Yudhishthira has a conversation with Bhishma.
Right.
And Bhishma is very conscious. It's not talking about in the Rajadharma, how should you be? It says what are the results of your action should look like on communities.
Right.
Or in the Ramayana, when it's so beautifully illustrated by Valmiki, when Bharata goes to Rama and he says, I'm not ready to be a king. Now you got to tell me how to rule the kingdom in your absence. There also Rama gives a set of actions. It's not about how Bharata should conduct himself alone. It's not important. And if you look at Arthashastra of Kautilya in a very practical way, even there he looks at actions, but he doesn't stop there. He's the one who connects it and says it's about Lokasangraha, it's also about Yogakshema. But he says that can be achieved only when the ruler or who's in that position to do that attains Indriya Nigraha or Indriya Vijaya. He becomes, so that's again inward looking, right? The control of my senses. The West celebrates the expression of your sensual achievements and attainments, whereas East talks of subsumation or sublimation of it and goes deep within you. And the connection, when I said Atmano Mokshartham, it's about personal inner evolution to the external manifestation of service for others. You can't get a more powerful expression of leadership.
So in some sense, the leaders are embedded in a context, but this embeddedness is different in the two perspectives, right? So in the West, perhaps there are market mechanisms, incentives, rewards outside of you, which connect you as a leader to that context. But here, it's intrinsic. So you are, you're driven internally by this motivation to serve others, and intrinsically you are embedded in this larger context.
For the end, it's a means for the end result of inner evolution in a spiritual way. So I describe it as leadership being
it's a personal journey.
Yes, a personal spiritual journey. That's what I articulate it as.
Correct.
So I'm not saying which is better, which is good or bad. Today it's such a highly interconnected world. So I think this combination is what will make the world a better place. In the last chapter, all right, when I start off, I explain why you need the leadership I'm talking about. And the last chapter I talk about in the epilogue, the Dharma of legacy and the legacy of Dharma. And trying to explain what is the model, drawing inspiration from my own understanding of Prime Minister Modi's leadership as a practical toolkit that I can demonstrate. What does the world need today?
So following on that, Balu, how does me engaging on a journey of self-discovery and, my own spiritual journey make the world I serve a better place? How does that happen? Because one may also argue that this is making you a better this achieves better individual outcomes than it does better outcomes for the organization or the society that you are positioned to serve, or you have been tasked to serve.
See, if you look at it from growing up in the Indian circumstance, which both of us most of our lives did, we take it for granted, the very purpose of existence and life, though we are not really living it every day, but at least in different conversations, in the storylines that we have learned or the folklore that somebody told us, it's all about that the final journey or the final goal of life is to understand, discover yourself and see yourself as one with God, if you can call it that, in the ultimate sense. Okay. There's a Vyavaharik life, which is the expression of leadership in the outside world. There's Adhyatmic life, the inner journey that we all undertake. I also use the example of Darshana there, where you go on a journey, people think you're going to temples, but you use the opportunity to reflect on what the experiences are in a very deeply inner space. Now, what I'm trying to articulate is that Like Vivekananda says it so beautifully. What inspired me to get into this was, he says, what's the point sitting in the Himalayas, meditating and wanting to seek moksha on your own when thousands of people are hungry in the rest of the country? How do you connect this? And that's why I think Indian thinking, the practical Vedanta, the practical part of Vedanta is not just about ourselves. For you to understand and appreciate that in the cultural DNA that we all come from, I'm talking of India in a larger context, not just, I'm talking civilizationally, not just the current world, which is all, it's very differently shaped today. It's a hybridized version in any country today. But the deep sense, if you look at India, our entire world was to see, how do I see myself in you? It's about discovering the oneness of existence. It's about reaching the space of Advaitic experience. Well, in a Western way, you can also argue that people like Otto Schwammer and others in MIT have described theory U and say the ultimate space is that co-generative space where we become one. Or Mihaly in his work, I quote that also. And he talks about flow, and in that flow, space of flow is oneness of with your actions. That's exactly what the Gita says. Ekatvam and samatvam. We are actually, you are unaffected. One is by what the noise outside, and therefore all this is just life in an illusory way, if you can talk of it in Maya. But it's also about my interconnectedness to the rest of the world. So this powerful belief that we are all one, and that the journey is to seek that space of oneness and interconnectedness. The highest expression of leadership, even in terms of Warren Bennis, is that self-transformation phase, he says, where you appreciate reciprocity and interdependence to the point where there's no real separateness. And everybody talks the same thing, but they use different language for the cultural context of that country, right? When Warren Bennis says it, he possibly says it embedded in the context of the United States.
Right.
But if you actually, it's very natural to us, because in the context of India, that is your struggle for life itself. It's about everybody's struggle to discover himself in the other. And that's what I have tried to articulate it, but that has to be useful.
Correct.
Unless you're societally useful, what's the point in having the journey? And so Atmano Mokshartham is important, but it has to result in Jagat Hita also.
It is what results in better service.
I think it's two ways. Okay. It's an output of what is the journey.
But it's
also about, through
the
doing it, your journey grows and you get deeper into it. But the selflessness in this action, it's not about being seen as a leader. It's not being recognized for it. It's not about some particular gain I get out of it, a pecuniary gain I get out of it. But if I can separate myself from all this, from the transactionality of why I perform the action, if you can transcend the doership and the enjoyership, like what the Bhagavad Gita talks about in Karma Yoga, I think that is ultimate of leadership.
Okay. In terms of, the Indic literature, it also has its origins in a time which was very different from what it is today, one may argue. Right, that structures were very hierarchical. There was a king, and there was an onus of judgment disproportionately rested on one individual, right? But today's world is different. Like there is so much literature that says now that, for instance, breakthrough innovations come from teams. They don't come from individuals. The era of the lone inventor, sitting there and churning out is gone. So there's a lot of emphasis over time on how people can work together, right, to achieve outcomes. Am I inaccurate in saying that, when we turn to the Indic literature, it's largely a focus on individual, ironically also on traits, because you do outline these 6 Indic traits, that the individual has. But it's silent on how you can, for instance, empower other people, how you can get other people to work with each other and with you, and how you collaboratively drive outcomes. Is that vague or unspecified in this literature? It's
not. In fact, I would argue the other way around and say that possibly the way you described it is definitely inaccurate. See, all these principles and paradigms, I would say you look at the principle or paradigm, not the storyline. The storyline is in a context.
Sure.
Like Ramayana happened in a context or Mahabharata happened in a context. Don't take the storyline, but take the principles or paradigms of it. And that's what I have tried to extract. And I'm not even saying everything in Indian literature is Indic literature is perfect. There's a lot of thrash there too, and we got to discard it as quickly as we can absorb what other things are there.
Right.
What I'm trying to bring out is, especially why am I using Prime Minister Modi as an example? And I'll connect it to that. The two reasons why I used it. The first reason is when we celebrate all this and we talk of something of the past, we make it so glorified and romanticized that we make it unachievable. Now, I can talk of Vivekananda lived like this, or Ramana Maharishi was like this, or Aurobindo was like that, or Ambedkar was like this, or Gandhi was like that. The easiest escape point for all of us is to put them on a pedestal, worship them, and then to move on with life.
Right.
So we don't really take the message in the context in which they gave it, articulate it in today's context, and see how I can apply it and live that life. So I realized that unless you give a flesh and blood example of somebody who makes it so accessible to us, a young little tea seller on a footpath to becoming the prime minister of a country with all the barriers of politics that you can experience, gives us hope.
Sure.
And gives the opportunity that I can also possibly try to be that. You don't have to be a prime minister of a country. You can be a leader of an organization. You can be a leader in your own home, family, community, whatever it is, but that expression of leadership. So that is one reason why I thought it's a great, powerful example. The second reason is I have never seen a person being able to balance out so many complex contradictions in today's world. Today's world of wicked problems, as Weber and Rittel call it, is really wicked.
Right.
And solving them is not going to be easy. You need collaborative spaces. You need to get stuff which is very, and the language that he uses. For example, he keeps telling, and those of us who are access to the kind of information he provides to his close teammates, he says, "Main nahi hum." And the humanness which he brings into the conversation, and even right from his communication abilities. Now, I've spoken about Sadharanikaran as a tool of communication. It's a very powerful Indian concept, maybe thousands of years old. Bharata in his Natya Shastra talks about it. How do you communicate? Like the two of us are communicating now.
Right.
The Western methodology of communication is, I understand your question in a particular way, decode whatever you encoded when you asked me, think about it and reply back. So it's very transactional at one level.
Sure.
The struggle is to decode and encode.
Right.
But whereas Bharata goes deeper and he brings in the concept of rasas and bhava, and he says, more than that, he says we're connected at a deep emotional level.
Right.
Now, I can have the same conversation with some other professor at ISB. Maybe the level of the depth of the bhava would be different.
Right.
And so my answers could be very different.
Right.
That's a reality of communication that Bharata describes.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating concept.
And he talks about saharidayata, where the unification of hearts happen, the interconnectedness. That is what he says leads to sahakaryata. I have seen that in Prime Minister Modi's life. So you can say it's an Indic concept, but you can't be more specific about collaboration than this. Saharidayata leading to sahakari. The way he inspired people, communities to act. So I think Indic literature is full of these kind of concepts. It celebrates the hero. Abhimanyu is celebrated. But Abhimanyu by himself in his valorous conquest is celebrated as much as the fact that all the allies came together.
Right.
The Pandavas and Kauravas didn't fight their battles alone. Right. They were all together. So I think if you are able to draw out and tease out the storylines in a way which is contextually relevant today, and the powerful example I want to give from the Indic literature, which he balances out, is we talk of shreyas and prayas in Indic literature. The enjoyment that comes from short-term joys that you do, a good meal you have, a movie you watch. I'm not saying that's not important. The prayas is there. But the shreyas is the long-term purpose of life. And what do I have to do here? Teaching in ISB and your students evaluating you very good is the prayers. But maybe the long-term vision you might have is to build a cohort of young people who can make this world a better place. That is the shreyas. This ability to balance and connect the two, Prime Minister Modi does it so well. And this is powerfully brought out in our Indic scriptures. And that cannot be done. The prayers enjoyment can be individualistic, but the shreyas betterment is always collaborative and extensively wider. So I think I would say that the literature is quite clear that the journey can be individualistic. That's where you begin. All of us start on those journeys. But at some point, you recognize there's no separation at all. There's no other.
Yeah, no, I think there is this, theme which, because as you were speaking, I'm thinking, yes, so there's a general construct of communication, but how it is instantiated in the West is different from how it is instantiated here. And there is also a cultural element here, right? So if communication necessarily has to be different here than it is over there in some ways. But there are also, these elements of communication and rhetoric in a manner to actually alter your identity, or, you feel like your identity has shifted, is very powerful. So I think, those are all very powerful concepts.
And I write about it, whether it's a pagadi, the turban he wears in particular situations, or the veshti or the mundu he wears in the southern parts of India. So that creates that emotional connectedness. And after that, the way I interpret what you say is very different from how I would have interpreted you in some other context.
Absolutely. I think, although you've said this is the leadership legacy of Narendra Modi, there are lessons here, but I think you're telling us that this is not just an account of his leadership, but it's an account or a demonstration of the Indic leadership framework that has more far-reaching implications, right? It's more generalizable. I also felt as a researcher that, usually we want, for us, a framework has to be generalizable, right? For it to be a framework. And this is established either through reasoned thinking or through empirical analysis. But I think your depth of analysis of different individuals, I mean, of course, Prime Minister Modi shines through in this. But what you talked about, right, the communities you lived with, the people who led these communities, there are these illustrations that you brought together very wonderfully, I think, in this book. And therefore, it's more than just an account of one individual's leadership. It's much more. And there are lessons, I think, for leaders and organizations at large here that would be very useful.
I think you distilled it out beautifully. This is not a biography of the Prime Minister, which I never attempted that, and I don't think I have enough material to even write it. This is a book on Indic leadership.
Yeah.
And trying to say why we need it and how it can complement what is already a body of literature and knowledge. I don't want to classify as Western, Eastern, North, South, etc.
Existing literature.
Yeah, existing literature. And how do you make it relatable to all of us is to have a lived example.
Sure.
And so I have seen and tried to bring it out saying that these are true because somebody can live it. And somebody who's only access to this kind of information in his life has lived it. And therefore, we try to package it this way. And end of the day is all of us want to make this world a better place.
Absolutely.
And public leaders, my worry is today's problems, wicked problems, as a policy analyst, that was my life till recently, like looking at policy and what it happens and what it does not do or does do. I realized that the policy maker sometimes causes the problem.
Correct.
Right? He has to be sensitive in at least trying to mitigate the problem by thinking through solutions. So he needs to have a particular leadership mindset. So this is not a book written for public leaders alone. I have had corporate leaders who have endorsed it, right from Bill Gates to N. Chandra to Anand Mahindra. And all of them feel that this is an excellent book for corporate leadership. As much as my civil society friends say that, wow, this is exactly your civil society experience.
Yeah, the principles
are very generic. So the genericity which you said is for across sectors, across domains, for just everybody, from a homemaker to a head of a country. I think principles will be the same. The way the principles get applied and to express ourselves to make the world better external to us is something different. So when Archie Brown talks about the myth of a powerful leader and the myth of a strong leader, he describes about the myth from a power without perspective.
Right.
So I thought it was time for the world to have literature from the power within perspective, and therefore this is distinctly different.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for writing this, sharing this, and thank you for coming here and sharing your
thoughts. I must thank you also for your endorsement of the book and writing a blurb for this book. Thank you, Deepa.
Thank you, Bala.